a break from the past painting traditions. There were several areas in Impressionist artists moved away from the established practices of art at the time. These involved the use of color, their choice of subject matter and settings, and their technique for capturing light and conveying movement, color, and light. The painting conventions and technique of earlier periods were very concerned with light, form, and composition. It's very different from the Impressionist painting with freely brushed colors that says more for a visual effect and detailed rendering of the subject. They used a very short stroke and that were intentionally or a very short broken strokes that were intended to be visible to the viewer. He also often placed pure unmixed colors side by side rather than blended smoothly or shaded. The result was a feeling of energy and intensity as the colors appeared to shift, move again, just they do in reality. So, Impressionist painters also painted everyday subjects. The painters began to break from the creation of formally posed portraits, grandiose depictions of mythical, literary, historical, religious subjects. They ventured in capturing scenes of life around them, like household, landscapes, seascapes, houses, cafes, and buildings. They painted outside of the studio and went outside. They presented ordinary people seemingly caught off guard doing everyday tasks of work and leisure, doing nothing, and they were not made to look beautiful or lifelike, as body parts could be distorted and facial features merely suggested by a few strokes of brush. They painted outdoors. The location of Impressionist painters was so different. The live portraits and landscapes usually painted inside the studio. However, Impressionist painters cannot get best capture ever-changing effects and lights and colors in painting. Open composition. Impressionist painting also moved away from the formal, structured approach in placing and positioning their objects. They experimented with unusual visual angles, size of objects that appeared out of proportion, off center, placement, and empty spaces on the canvas. The influence of photography. Photography in its early stages at this time as well as gained popularity. Photography inspired Impressionists to capture fleeting moments of action, whether in landscape or in day-to-day lives of people. But whereas camera snapshots provided objective true-life images, the painters were able to offer a subjective view of the subject, expressing their personal perceptions rather than creating an exact representation. They also had the advantage of manipulating colors, which the photograph at the time was still lack. Impressionism, works of Monet, Renoir, and Manet. By the 1870s, the stage was set in the emergence for the next major art movement in Europe, Impressionism. It started with a group of French painters that include Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, and Edouard Manet, and eventually spread to other countries such as Italy, Germany, and Netherlands. Claude Monet was one of the founders of the Expressionist movement, along with his friends Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frederic Bazille. He was the most prominent of the group and is considered the most influential figure in the movement. Monet is the best known for his landscape paintings, particularly those depicting his beloved flower gardens, water lily ponds at his home in Giverny. Augusto Renoir, along with Claude Monet, was one of the central figures in the Impressionist movement. His early works were snapshots of real life, full of sparkling color and light. By the mid 1880s, however, Renoir broke away from the Impressionist movement to apply a more disciplined, formal technique in portraits of actual people and paintings. Edouard Manet. He was one of the first 19th century artists to depict modern life subject. He was a key figure in the transition from realism to impressionism, with a number of his works considered as marking the birth of modern art. PostImpressionism, works of Cezanne and Van Gogh. After the brief yet highly influential period of Impressionism, an outgrowth of movement known as Post-Impressionism emerged. The European artists who were at the forefront of this movement continued using the basic qualities of Impressionists before them, the vivid colors, heavy brushstrokes, and true-to-life subjects. However, they expanded and experimented with these bold new ways, like using geometric approach, fragmenting objects, and distorting people's faces and body parts, and applying colors that were not necessarily realistic or natural. Two of the foremost impressionists were Paul Cézanne. Two of the most post-impressionists were Paul Cézanne and Vincent van Gogh. Paul Cézanne, a French artist and post-impressionist painter, his work exemplified the transition from 19th century impressionism to a new radically different world of art in 20th century, paving the way for the next revolutionary art movement known as Expressionism. Vincent van Gogh was a post-impressionist painter from the Netherlands. His works were remarkable for their strong, heavy brushstrokes, intense emotions, and colors that appeared to almost pulsate with energy. Van Gogh's striking style was to have far-reaching influence on the 20th century art, with his works becoming among the most recognized in the world. Expressionism, a bold new movement. In the early 1900s, a movement arose in Western art world that became to be known as Expressionism. Expressionist artists created works with more emotional force rather than a realistic natural images. To achieve this, they distorted outlines, applied strong colors, and exaggerated forms. They worked more than their imagination and feelings, rather than what their eyes saw in the physical world. Among the various styles that arose in expressionist movements were neo-primitivism, Fauvism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Social Realism. Let's talk about neo-primitivism first. It was an art style that incorporated elements from native arts in the South Sea Islanders and wood carving of African tribes that surged in popularity at that time. Among the Western artists who adapted these elements was Amedeo Modigliani, who used oval faces and elongated shapes of African art in his both sculptures and paintings. Fauvism was a style that used bold, vibrant colors and visual distortions. Its name was derived from the les fauves, or wild beast, referring to the group of French expressionist painters who painted in this style. Perhaps the most known among them was Henri Matisse. Dadaism. Dadaism was a style characterized by a dream fantasy, memory images, and visual tricks. And the surprise, as the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico, although the works appeared playful, the movement arose from the pain that the group of European artists felt after the suffering brought by the World War I. Wishing to protest against civilization that had brought on such horrors, these artists rebelled against established norms and authorities, and against the traditional styles in art. They chose the child's term by hobby horse Dada to refer to their new non-style. Surrealism was a style that depicted an illogical, subconscious dream that seemed to exist beyond the logical conscious physical one. Its name came from the term super-realism, with each artwork clearly expressing a departure from reality, as though the artists were dreaming, seeing illusions, or experiencing altered mental state. Many surrealist works depicted morbid, gloomy, gloomy subjects as those. Perhaps the best known surrealist was Salvador Dali. On a previous page I was reading a while ago, others seem to be quite playful and even humorous, such as those are by Mark Chagall, Paul Klee, and Joan Miro. Salvador Dali's very famous painting, The Persistence of Memory. Social realism. The movement known as social realism expressed the artist's role in social reform. Hence, the artists used their works to protest against injustices, inequalities, immorality, and the ugliness of the human condition. In different periods of history, social realists have addressed different issues of history. Social realists have addressed like corruption, poverty, war, industrial and environmental hazards, and more in the hope of raising people's awareness and pushing society to seek reforms. Pablo Picasso's Guernica was recognized as the most influential comprehensive statement of social realism against the brutality of war. Filling one wall of the Spanish Pavilion in 1937 at World's Fair in Paris. It was Picasso's outcry against a German air raid of the town Guernica in native Spain. It was created in the mid-1900s. Guernica, combined with artistic elements developed in the earlier decades, which with those still to come. It made the use of exaggeration, distortion, shock technique of Expressionism. At the same time, it had elements of emerging style that will be later known as Cubism. Abstractionism, another group of artistic styles, emerged at the same time as the Expressionist movement. It had the same spirit of freedom, expression, openness that characterized life in the 20th century, but is different from Expressionism in certain ways. This group of styles was known as Abstractionism. Abstractionist movement arose from the intellectual points of view in the 20th century. In the world of science, physicists were formulating a new view of the universe, which resulted to concepts of space and time. This intellectualism was reflected even in art. While Expressionism was emotional, Abstractionism was logical and rational, involved analyzing, detaching, selecting, and simplifying. In the previous centuries, works of art were a reflection of one way or another, of outside world. In 20th century Abstractionism, natural appearances become unimportant. Artists reduced a scene into a geometrical shape, patterns, lines, angles, textures, and swirls of color. The resulting work ranged from representational abstractionism, depicting a still recognizable subject, to pure abstractionism, where no recognizable subject could be discerned. Grouped under abstractionism are the following art styles: Cubism, Futurism, Mechanical style, Non-objectivism. The Cubist style, or the Cubism, is derived from the word cube, a three-dimensional geometric figure composed of strictly measured lines, planes, and angles. Cubist works were therefore a play of planes and angles on a flat surface. Among the Cubists was the Spanish painter and sculptor Pablo Picasso. In earlier styles, subjects were depicted in a three-dimensional manner, performed or formed by light and shadow. In contrast, the Cubists analyzed their subjects' basic geometric forms and broke them into series of planes. They are resembled these planes, tilting and interlocking them in different ways. In addition, the art of the past centuries had depicted a scene from the single stationary point of view. In contrast, Cubism took contemporary view that things are actually seen hastily in fragments and from different points of view at the same time. This was reflected in the depiction of objects from more than one visual angle in the same painting, the bull's head, in Picasso's Guernica. In human figures as well were often represented by facial features and body parts shown both frontally from a side angle at once. This gave a sense of imbalance and misplacement that created immediate visual impact. It also gave Cubism its characteristic feeling of dynamism, energy. To this day, variations of Cubism continue to appear in contemporary artworks. Futurism. The movement known as Futurism began in Italy in the early 1900s. As the name implies, the futurists created art for a fast-paced, machine-propelled age. They admired the motion, force, speed, and strength of mechanical forms. Thus, their works depicted the dynamic sensation of all of these, as can be seen in the works of Italian painter Gino Severini. Mechanical style. As a result of futurist movement, what became known as the mechanical style emerged. In this style, basic forms like planes, cones, spheres, cylinders all fit together precisely and neatly in their appointed places. This can be seen in the works of Fernand Léger in mechanical parts such as crankshafts, cylinders, blocks, pistons, brightened only by the use of primary colors. Otherwise, they are lifeless. Even human figures are mere outlines rendered purposely without expression. Non-objectivism. The logical geometric conclusion of Abstractionism came to a style known as non-objectivism. From the very term of non-object, works in this style did make the use of figures, even representation of images. Works in this style did not make use of figures, even representation of figures. They did not refer to a recognizable object or forms in the outside world. Lines, shapes, and colors were used in a cool, impersonal approach aimed for balance, unity, and stability. Colors were mainly black, white, and the primaries, red, yellow, and blue. Foremost among the non-objectivists was Dutch painter Pierre Mondrian.